The Dungeon of Naheulbeuk, the Amulet of Chaos, is an RPG fantasy adventure game with complex turn-based combat and party customization. The story is you control a company of adventurers on a quest to find an ancient statue in a dungeon that has supposedly never been entered, but you almost immediately get cursed by the Amulet of Chaos. You'll control a party of 7 archetypes of the fantasy genre. You have a ranger, an elf archer, a wizardess, barbarian, thief, ogre, and of course, a dwarf. Now, one side of this game is characterized by the interaction of these characters, as the fully voiced dialogue gets a lot of mileage out of fantasy satire, adult humor, genre tropes, and fourth wall breaking situations. If you're looking for a deep and dark fantasy world to RPG in, this isn't it. The other side is a surprisingly deep and well-executed turn-based fantasy combat strategy game. You control the whole party, which by the way means that this is single player only, there are no co-op or multiplayer options. As each character takes their turn against the challenging and sometimes overpowered opponents, there is a lot to consider in the combat system of this game. It is important to consider initiative, meaning the turn order of your party and the enemy, and you do have a strategic skip option to let other characters go first if you want to build on their moves. For each turn, each character has 2 action points, which are intended to be used, one for movement and one for an action, but you can use both of them for movement if you want to sprint ahead. The action options include the standard ones like melee attack, range attack, magic, defensive stance, or overwatch. But each character also has multiple unlockable and upgradable special abilities with a longer cooldown. These might be special attacks with an area effect, buffs for the whole party, or effects to give that specific character a special advantage in multiple ways. Now, all of these special abilities and even the normal attack abilities interact and stack and reinforce other characters' actions, so you have to be very strategic about turn order and planning how to have the maximum effect for each action. You also have to think about which direction the character is facing, because the enemy will try to flank or backstab you, and you can track the exact movement by using control and selecting one square at a time. It is important to think about taking cover if there are ranged enemies in play, but be aware that a lot of the environment is destructible and there can be traps. Another very important factor that you always have to be aware of is opportunity attacks. This is when you are face to face with an enemy and move in front of them, they will have the option to attack you as you pass by, even if it's not their turn. An element that I particularly liked was the chance of collateral damage and even friendly damage, especially if you're doing a range or magic attack. And this chance is determined by the character's abilities, but also a roll of the dice. As you go through the dungeon, you will also find lots of equipment, extra weapons, magical items that buff you that you can add to different characters to change their abilities as you go through the story. And remember that all of the enemies have all of these options and factors to consider as well, meaning they also often have special abilities, opportunity attacks, and sometimes fall victim to friendly fire. With more than 100 different enemy types and boss battles, the combat never feels repetitive or boring. Other cool features during combat include the slow motion kill cams and the movable camera, although I often felt that the camera couldn't get quite close enough or quite wide enough. There's also a serious difficulty curve as you come out of the tutorial, and the curse factor becomes more important because you'll find yourself in situations where you have almost no chance of success. This means you're going to get beaten down hard, you will have to regroup, rest up, maybe take some side quests to level up and find some better equipment, and then try it again and hope for better luck. As you go through the dungeon trying to get rid of the curse and complete your quest, you'll realize that you are not the first people to pass through here, not at all. In fact, there are whole areas inhabited by civilized people, including taverns where your party can rest, people with side quests, shops with special items and equipment, and more. These areas break up the difficult and sometimes tense combat and make the game world feel more like a semi-open world RPG than a linear dungeon crawler. The game will take at least 30 hours to complete just if you focus on the main story, and a lot more if you are easily distracted by shiny side quests. So that tells you what this game has to offer. The only question left is, should you play it? But first you should know that this game is going to be completely free to claim for 1 week from the Epic Games Store starting June 29th, 2023. You'll have 1 week to add it to your library, and then you keep it forever and install install it whenever you want. And that is what we do on this channel. We play and review every free weekly game from the Epic Game Store, so subscribe so you never have to be bored ever again. So for a long time, I was really split on this game while playing through it, and so I have to approach it in two different ways. Everything outside the turn-based combat kind of bounced off me, and from the very first lines of dialogue, it felt far too silly and, in my opinion, too obsessed with the plan to show that, hey, we're not taking ourselves too seriously. And everything about the story, dialogue, characters, the environment fit into this feeling that they're trying too hard to have this very particular vibe. That meant that it is consistent throughout, so if adult tongue-in-cheek humor is your thing, then you'll get a lot of it here, and in fact nothing else. For me, this was immersion-breaking and really unfunny, and although it's weird to say this as an American, but the fact that the voice actors were almost all American just kind of grated on the fantasy setting for me because, well, we know that fantasy characters have British accents, right? This story choice also conflicted with the combat, which was deep, well-planned, engaging, tense, and really a pleasure to play, even coming from me who I don't lean towards turn-based combat, but this was really well executed. I found myself getting a lot of enjoyment out of all the strategic options, and even enjoying a bit of the unfair chaos in the long combat sections, and I was actually dreading returning to the cheesy dialogue when the combat ended. Now, I think the combat system was good enough that this game is worth giving a try if you can overlook the lack of any real character development or meaningful story. And hey, if that kind of silly world is your thing, well, so much the better. But in my opinion, I would say that you should approach this as a tactical fantasy combat game with well-crafted mechanics. And if you're looking for a fantasy world to get immersed into or fantasy creatures to roleplay as and get attached to, then you should probably look elsewhere. Tell us in the comments if you'll be giving this a try, and if you're looking for a similar game with a more serious story element, then we've also reviewed the digital version of Gloomhaven, which might scratch that itch for an engaging fantasy world and deep turn-based combat. Check it out and see you next time.